You may have heard about Rav Moshe's Teshuvot on whiskey. What's the deal with that? A little bit of wine involved. How does that all come together? Well, that's something we're going to explore on this episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. Welcome, everybody, to the newest episode of The Jewish Drinking Show. I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest of the show, Rabbi Dov Linzer. Rabbi Linzer, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. All right. So for those less familiar with Rabbi Linzer, he is the president and Rosh HaYeshiva of YCT Rabbinical School, my alma mater. Having served as YCT's Rosh HaYeshiva for over 20 years, Rabbi Linzer became its president in 2019 and assumed both the institutional and Torah-based leadership of YCT. In his capacity as a mentor, Rabbi Linzer provides religious guidance to the yeshiva students and the over 150 YCT ordained rabbis who are serving in the field. An acclaimed Torah and Halakha scholar, Rabbi Linzer has been a leading rabbinic voice in the modern Orthodox community for over 25 years. He has published over 100 Teshuvot, responsa, and scholarly Torah articles, as well as hosting a number of highly popular Torah podcasts, including Iggeros Moshe YD, the 42nd episode of which he discussed our topic today, blended whiskies in Rav Moshe Feinstein's Teshuvot. He is co-author, together with Abigail Pograbin, of It Takes Two to Torah, an Orthodox rabbi and Reform journalist discuss and debate their way through the 5 books of Moses, and will soon be coming out with another book, The Rosh Yeshiva Responds, a collection of his scholarly halachic teshuvot to the yeshivas, hundreds of rabbis in the field. So teshuvot is clearly a theme, a connective theme, and I'm going to continue pulling on that theme, which is we're discussing Rav Moshe, really mainly one teshuvah, although sort of a trilogy of teshuvot of his. That he authored in the late 1940s. So before we dive into our topic today, especially since you've published, I think, over 50 episodes of that Rav Moshe Teshuvot podcast. So can you share with us, especially for those who are less familiar, both Rav Moshe as a rabbinic figure and then also his Teshuvot in particular?
Rav Moshe Feinstein was born in 1895 and passed away in 1986. So he lived over 90 years, and he emigrated to the States in 1937. And he really was the foremost posek for Orthodoxy within the United States, not in Israel, but certainly within the United States. And he lived at a time when so much revolution was going on within the world, and so much change in terms of advances in technology, in medicine, at the social level, feminism, different movements, and he was present for all of this, and he was writing Teshuvot and responding to to everything that was going on around him. And I think one of the things, there's a lot of things that I love about him, but one in particular is that he saw his role not just as a posek for the yeshivish community, even though that was a community he associated with, but for the entire Orthodox community, including modern Orthodox. And there's a real, modern sensibilities to his psakim, valuing a lot of things in terms of the larger world, and also a desire that psak and halacha should work for everybody and not just for a certain segment of the community.
And so that's him. And then beyond, these definitely have a legacy, these Teshuvot. How would you describe the legacy that these have left?
Of all of the Iggeros Moshe, it's hard to really capture all of that.
Or more broadly, sort of the broader legacy of his Teshuvot.
I'll say two things. I mean, first of all, without getting into the specific Teshuvot, one of the things that was so powerful about him as a posek was his creativity and his preparedness to break new ground, come up with new ways of framing halachot, bring halachot that had been never applied to certain new phenomenon, and find ways to bridge them and to apply them. His lasting legacy was that he really laid the foundation of halachic life for most of, in the modern world and with the modern realities, whether they're societal or technological or like something like medical ethics, and he laid that sort of shaped the basic rhythms of the living of the Orthodox community till today. Although I will say that because he was more lenient and because he wanted to speak to the broader Orthodox community, in recent years, the more yeshivish community is not so necessarily eager to follow his rulings. Something maybe that we'll also talk about when about when we're going to focus on blended whiskey. They say, well, when Rav Moshe gave those rulings, that was for his time when community needed more leniencies, but that's not the real halacha, or that's not the ideal halacha. So there's actually been a push to the right, I think, less an embracing of his positions now within the yeshivish community than used to be.
We're going to dive in. So the Teshuvot in front of us, this is his first Yoredea volume. This is from 1948. It's on blended whiskey. So Rabbi Teitz from Elizabeth asks him about these blended whiskeys. And if I'm right, it's like 2% of it may possibly, we don't necessarily know, may possibly have wine included with them. And he's asking Rav Moshe about this. Do you want to take us through both the question and
So I assume you and your audience probably knows a lot more about the reality of blended whiskey than I do, but blended whiskeys are whiskeys that are blended from, sometimes different whiskeys, and also sometimes other liquids are blended in together with them. Sometimes it's for the sake of taste. One of the additives that they add also is glycerin, which Rav Moshe discusses, which is like an animal byproduct, which is, I think, added to do something to make the taste smoother. So that's an issue that will have to be addressed. And sometimes they add wine. And the reason, from what I understand, having done a little bit of research, is that wine might be added not just for taste reasons, like with an assumption that it'll improve the taste, but because there's a different taxes based on the alcohol content of of the whiskey and of the ingredients that are put in. So wine is taxed at a lower rate than the actual whiskey itself, but it doesn't lower the alcohol content as much as something like water would, because it's got its own alcohol content. Anyway, for various reasons, different things are put in to make blended whiskey. And the two ingredients that Rav Moshe is addressing, is concerned about, or the concern was raised to him, was the fact that sometimes wine is added and sometimes glycerin. As I said, glycerin is as an animal byproduct. That's a concern. Wine is, there's Rav Moshe sometimes, or halacha sometimes, talks about yayin nesech, which is wine that was poured as a libation for, in a pagan worship. And that's a very weighty prohibition. And it's of a biblical nature, and it's forbidden. You can't even derive benefit from such wine. But then there's a rabbinic type of category that's called stam yenam, which is the just general wine that's used by non-Jews, that's touched by non-Jews. If it's produced by non-Jews, it's in the stam yenam category. And the rabbis prohibited that because of two reasons. One is maybe because it, in theory, could be used in this type of idolatrous context. And the other is out of concern of over-socializing and intermarriage. So, that's why, even though all wine is basically fermented grape juice, why is there this whole industry of kosher wine? Because of this category of stam yenam that can't be touched by non-Jews. So if wine is being added and it's not kosher wine, which is the assumption that it isn't, then the question is, shouldn't that make the whiskey forbidden? Because it's a mixture of a kosher and a non-kosher product. If you had non-kosher, if you had a little bit of treif mixed into your whiskey, you'd say it's treif. So it shouldn't be the same if you have a little bit of wine mixed in as well. Rav Moshe says that it's not mentioned on the list of ingredients. I think he has an assumption that the ingredient list doesn't have anything under 2% or 2.5%. I don't know if that's true. I know that's I believe I heard that that's no longer, if that ever was the case, it's no longer the case. The ingredient lists tend to be very complete. But anyway, but Rav Moshe says, since it's not on the ingredient list, the most we should be concerned about is that it's, if there is wine, is that it's under 2%. So will that be a problem or not? So that was the question that was asked to him. It was presented to him, as you said, by Rabbi Pinchas Teitz, who was the Mor D'Atra of Elizabeth, New Jersey. And Rabbi Teitz himself had set up a a hechsher for blended whiskey and to oversee its production because he was concerned exactly about these issues. And he produced blended whiskey with a hechsher. And he asked Rav Moshe, maybe he had heard that Rav Moshe didn't feel it needed one. And he asked Rav Moshe to clarify, Rav Moshe's positions on blended whiskey and the need for a hechsher.
By the way, I love the way that as part of the question or the beginning to answer for Rav Moshe, he says, even I really try not to drink it ever, but I'll drink it socially. If there's a social gathering, I'll drink it. I don't want to be seen as religiously haughty. And, but he says, nevertheless, maybe I should stay away from it. But it's really cute that Rav Moshe says, I'll drink this whiskey socially.
Right. I would say it's more than cute. I think that, sometimes it's interesting to note, like, the way of tshuva is framed is also very important beyond just the halachic argument that's being made.
Right.
And if Rav Moshe started the tshuva by saying something like, oh, this is a really big problem because you got stam yenim, you got glycerin, let's go through, let's see if we can figure out how this is allowed. And then at the very end, he said, what he's going to say, oh, here's why it's okay. Then it's like, okay, it's okay, but it's a very, very big problem. I'm not really sure I should do it. It took all these paragraphs for him to argue that it's okay, right? But if he starts by saying, look, that he says, look, it really isn't an issue. And even though it's nice to be machmir, I myself will drink it. Already, like the whole weight of the question has gone off. You're told the answer right at the beginning. You're told even Rav Moshe personally is prepared to do it. So, you don't feel the weight of the issues that are coming afterwards. You know that, okay, he doesn't think that this is a big deal. And that changes, I think, a whole way of thinking about the question. And I think that's important because, he's dealing with a balancing act here. On the one hand, you have people that want to be machmir and want to have a hashkacha, and you have this Rabbi Teitz who felt it was very important and he gave it a hashkacha, and you don't want to be dismissive of that. And at the other hand, what he hasn't said here, but was maybe implicit, but he says explicitly later in the tshuva, is the widespread practice to drink blended whiskey, and not just amongst the common man, right? But even like great rabbis, it's like just widely accepted.
Yeah.
It's very similar to tshuvos he gives about chalav stam, about milk that you buy from the supermarket that isn't chalav Yisrael. That you have people that were very makpid on chalav Yisrael, and they set up whole industries around chalav Yisrael, but you had a widespread practice not to care about that. So here, a posek doesn't just give halacha. They have to be thinking about those social realities, right? You want to, if something is widely accepted, any good posek operates the sort of by default that if something is widely accepted by frum Jews, we're going to assume that it's okay. Like, it's not like it's impossible that it's us and there everybody is doing it, but the assumption is if it's widely done by frum Jews, it's got to be okay. We got to figure out why it's okay, right? So that's orientation number one. And you're not going to tell all these people, all the whatever, from rabbis and from people, whatever, oh, it's treif, it's a problem. You start with an orientation, it's got to be okay, let's figure out why. And at the same time, you don't want to, like I said, devalue those that want to be more machmir. So he does it right at the beginning. He says, like, yasher koach to you that you've made this, and it's good for people who want to be mahadrim. He cites a Gemara, in a Shulchan Aruch that says that real frum people will never eat anything that you need to ask a shayla about. It doesn't matter if it's kosher, if it's even something that was worthy of asking a shayla, that's not, I want to be so frum, so beyond reproach that, I'll only drink that stuff. So Rav Moshe validates a type of a frumkeit that wouldn't want to drink this, but very clearly puts it in the category of like a frumkeit, and says as a matter of halacha, it's totally okay, and lowers the temperature by saying that he himself, will even do it.
Yeah. So then he launches into four arguments arguing why it should be permissible. Is that correct?
Yeah.
All right.
So, So let's start with the most obvious question, which is, if it's a treif product, this wine. So if you had a little bit of like, I don't know, chazer, a little bit of pork juice in your whiskey, like nobody would say, oh, it's not a problem. First of all, we live in a world of hashgacha where even if it was only a tiny amount and it was batel, we say anything less than 1 in 60 is nullified. The world that we live in now with this was in very early on, what did we say it was, 1947?
48.
It was before hashgachot had totally taken over the entire food industry. So now that hashgachot have taken everything over, they wouldn't give a hechsher to something that had a treif ingredient in trace amounts that was batel. They want to have standards that, they don't want to have any treif ingredients in it, regardless of whether it's batel or not, and God bless them. But, before that time, if something had a very trace amount and it was batel, there's rules in halacha that once it's nullified, you can go ahead and buy it and you can go ahead and eat it. But certainly if it was more than 1 in 60, then, which is the normal, amount that we say it's so trace that it's like it disappears, it would be a problem. So if wine can be up to 2 or 2.5%, do your math, that's more than 1 in 60. How could it be that it's not a problem? That's the big question. And what Rav Moshe does is he demonstrates, and it's pretty straightforward, these positions, that there's a position of the Ravid. There's a debate in the Rishonim about what happens when you mix wine with water. Now, I don't know if you've discussed this at all again on your podcast. I have to apologize. I'm not a regular.
I have not. I have not discussed this.
Okay. Well, maybe you'll get somebody else to discuss this. This is really fascinating. Drinking is not a big part of my life. I'll just say nothing personal about your podcast.
That's fair.
Anyway.
You're not the first, and you probably won't be the last on the show to say that.
Okay, fine. Anyway, so the Gemara makes it clear that wine was never drunk raw, like just straight wine. It would always be mixed with water. Standard would be 3 parts water, 1 part wine, which was, I think, pretty standard in the Greek and Roman world. And it would be up to like 6 parts water, 1 part wine. By the way, even a mixture of 6 parts water, 1 part wine is halachically considered wine. So, for example, important note to your listeners: if you're making kiddush, and you don't have enough wine, right? You only have enough to fill up half a glass, right? What you should just do is just fill up just add water, because as long as it's like up to 1/6 wine, the mixture of water and wine is still considered wine. Okay. Also by Pesach, people spend extra money to get this low alcohol wine. Right. But what you could do is you could just take a little wine and add six parts water to 1 part wine, and halachically it's still wine, because they used to dilute the wine. Why did they used to dilute the wine? One reason was because the water was contaminated, so the alcohol in the wine would kill off some of the of the water. So it was basically to make just like drink a regular type of a drink available to them. Because they would just drink wine. They wouldn't drink water, but you also don't want to get drunk. So you want it to last a bit more. Anyway, that would be the standard that they would dilute. So based on that, the Ravid says that if you have more than 6 parts water to 1 part wine, means the wine is less than 16%, 16.6%, then it's not a problem. It's not stamyena. You can take non-Jewish wine. Now, you're not allowed to do this lechatchila because, at the outset, you're not allowed to intentionally create bittul, take something that's usser and mix it up in a way that it becomes permissible. But if it happened that water and wine was mixed and it was less than 1/6 wine, then it stops being yayin nesach and it's permissible to drink. And that's the way other Rishonim disagree. They say it's like any other treif thing, only less than 1 in 60, only less than 0.16%. 1.6%, not 16%, right? Only then would it be batel. But the Ravid says nope, anything less than 16.6% is batel. And Shulchan Aruch paskins that way, and the Ramah paskins that way, and one place the Ramah mentions the other opinion, but it's generally assumed that's the halacha. Water and wine mixed together, even non-kosher wine, it's batel if it's less than 1 in 6. Now, the question to ask here, and I've already sort of given the seed of the answer, the question to ask here is, why is it different? Why is non-kosher wine batel if it's less than 1/6, But if I have, I don't know, like a chazer juice, that needs, it needs to be less than 1 in 60. What's the difference? And the difference is that it's the reason this is forbidden is because it has a status of wine. And wine is a social drink. This has a status in the role that it plays as a social drink. And it's not just considered to be like fermented grape juice. So, for example, there are some halachot that if you cook the wine, it might not become, it doesn't become stam yenam because cooked wine didn't play the same role. Well, when water dilutes the wine so much that it's less than 1/6, it stops being wine. You don't say that I have water here with traces of wine in it. You say I have some grape beverage. That's what you have. You have a grape beverage, not water there's no wine here because you have a drink, and it's a drink which is a mixture of, liquids, and that drink is not wine. It's something else.
Right. It's too weak to be even considered to be wine.
Right. Yeah. And, and it's not considered wine flavored water. It's just like, it's like when you have cheese, it becomes, you have cheese product, right? What do they call it?
Right.
American cheese. Like when you can no longer call it cheese, you have to call it like cheese product, right? So this can no longer be called wine. Now, the question becomes, is that only about water, or does it apply to other liquids? Because we're not talking about mixing wine with water. We're talking about mixing wine with whiskey, right? So here it's a little confusing. In one place, the Rav Moshe Isserlis, who's the authority for the Ashkenazim, seems to say that it applies to other liquids as well. In another place, he seems to say when wine is mixed with other liquids, it doesn't go by 1 in 6, it goes by 1 in 60. So, and then there's a whole debate amongst poskim. Did the Rama really mean it when he said 1 in 60? Because elsewhere he says 1 in 6. And you have all these poskim lining up on both sides of the equation. And Rav Moshe basically comes down on the side that says it's, for Rav Moshe, he says it's very clear that other liquids are just like wine. And once it's less than 1 in 60, 1 in 6, it's batel. It's not a problem. Now, I should pause here because I've heard people that know about this Rav Moshe and misunderstand him to say that wine is always batel 1 in 6. That is clearly not true. If you're, let's say, marinating, I once got a question about somebody that marinated, their meat in wine, and they found out that the wine had been touched by their non-Jewish nanny, and it was not mevushal. So it's a whole problem, right? Or if that wine had fallen into the stew, there, when it's interesting, but when it's mixed with a solid, we say you have some wine in your meat, and wine isn't batel unless it's 1 in 60, because it's not a new beverage. It's meat with some wine in it. So that goes by the normal rules that you need 1 in 6, less than 1/60 to be batel. Or you have your cholent with a little wine in it. It's not a beverage, it's cholent with wine in it. So wine only stops, existing, becomes batel when it's less than 1 in 60. But when you have it mixed with a liquid, whether the liquid is water or whiskey, then you no longer have wine. You have a beverage, and because wine is less than 1 in 6, that beverage cannot be called wine. So that's the side that Rav Moshe comes down on, and he says, and therefore, it would totally, that's why it would totally be okay. But he acknowledges that there are poskim who say that other liquids are different than water and would be strict, but he rejects those positions.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode featuring Rabbi Dov Linzer, featuring the Teshuvot on whiskey of Rav Moshe. Speaking of Rav Moshes and drinking, well, here's a sneak peek to next week's episode featuring Rabbi Dr. Phil Lieberman on Rav Moshe Maimonides and his Mor Nevuchim, his Guide to the Perplexed, how he writes and talks about drinking.
Solomon devotes the whole book of Proverbs to warnings against fornication and intoxication, right? For those who wallow in these fall from God's grace and lose connection with God, right? So even, and he says this in part 3, right? It's not enough to prepare yourself for prophecy, to have all the qualities of a prophet, right? You can reach up and set all of the conditions in place, right? But to be someone like Moshe Rabbeinu, God has to, bestow something on you, right? And, right, if you drink or, engage in fornication, right, it's saying here, right, at least too much, right, you're going to step away. You're going to, kind of clog up that pipeline, and it's going to be difficult for you to connect to God.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Rabbi Dr. Phil Lieber. And of course, I hope you come back and check that episode out. Now back into this episode featuring Rabbi Dov Linzer. So he goes to the 1/6 rather than 1/60th. That's his first argument. He's got 3 more arguments he's got on deck. Of course, we've got this glycerin thing at the end. I know I'm going to the final one first for the next 3, but he goes for the glycerin argument because it doesn't provide flavor. It might provide maybe some texture, but it's not really that significant, right?
Exactly. And this is, a little surprising because it's like a trace ingredient. And again, as we said, hashgachas nowadays would never give a hechsher to something that had a trace ingredient, even if it was batel. But Rav Moshe says that, look, at the end of the day, it's a minute amount. It's less than 1 in 60. And even though it is put in for a reason to make it smoother, as long as it's not giving taste, it's not a problem if it's less than 1 in 60. I mean, I should say there are some things that don't give taste, like things that affect the color of something, so that's very visible, or that gives it form. But those are things that the impact that it's having is very visible. And those types of things, like gelatin would be an example, are problems even less than 1 in 60. But something that does not have a visible impact and doesn't affect the taste, and it's less than 1 in 60, so much says, fine, it's batel, even though it's a really trace ingredient. It's small enough and it's batel.
All right, so he's got 2 middle arguments here. The first of which is this one here about the factories and do we even know that there's wine, right? This is his second argument.
Right. So this is surprising. Rav Moshe says, look, we don't know what's in the under 2% ingredients. And we're concerned that it might be wine. Sometimes it is wine. But he says, but we don't even know if it is. So maybe we should just be lenient. We don't know that there's an Isser ingredient that's added. If it is an Isser ingredient, it's only a rabbinic one anyway. And maybe just that ignorance enough should allow us to assume that it's not a problem and say that it's okay. Now, anybody hearing this nowadays who's used to living in a world of hashgachas would be shocked out of their mind. What? The whole way you read it is you look at a list of ingredients, everything looks 100%, but you say, I don't know, there's no hashgacha, who knows what could be in it, and so on. But Rav Moshe was living in a world in which hashgachas were not yet pervasive. And in such a world, you can't assume that there's going to be a hashgacha industry that's going to tell you, and you have to, like many areas of halacha, you have to live your life by making reasonable assumptions. And we have rules about reasonable assumptions. One of them is a doubtful d'Rabbanan you could be lenient about. And there's all these types of assumptions you can make. And that's certainly true even today in many places in Europe where hashgachot are not as pervasive. It was true at the time of Rishonim that they would not know all the details, but they would make reasonable assumptions and assume if there's no real reason to think it's a problem, or we could be lenient and we can assume it's okay. Now, still, what is shocking is that you would imagine that these companies have a regular a formula, in terms of a recipe of what they put in it, and you could just with one phone call up and find out. Even if there weren't hashgacha, why don't we just say, ask the companies, find the brands that you like, and find out if they put in wine. So, and normally that's a principle in halacha, which is a suffix that's yachol levarer. If you can easily clarify it, you can't be in willful ignorance. It's more convenient for me not to know, so I'm not going to ask, right? But so even without living in our world of pervasive hashgacha, it's interesting that Rav Moshe would say that in something that is easily yachol levarer. But at the end of the day, Rav Moshe is just throwing that in as an additional reason. And he makes it clear that I'm just saying this as an additional reason, he says, but even if you know for certain they put in wine, I still stand by my first position, which is that it's less than 1 in 6, and therefore it's batel.
Yeah. And now we get to which is really his third, but for us, the final of his 4 reasons, which is this concern that one might be nullifying something that's forbidden at the outset, which is a no-no in Jewish law, and yet he says that's not actually a concern. And it's fascinating because he talks about these factors. This one is like this is the amusing part for me of this teshuvah. How would you describe this aspect?
Yeah, well, I'm curious why you find it amusing, but what I'll say is that
yeah.
he made his initial assumptions, first of all, are just, are normal halachic positions, but they're against what a lot of people assume. The principle is you're not allowed to intentionally mix something forbidden with something permissible, and in order to effect bitul. And if you do, the end product is forbidden. It's forbidden to you, and it's forbidden to the people for whom you did that mixture. Okay, that's the halacha. Well, what's the?
By the way, if I want, can I just interrupt?
Go ahead. Yeah,
it's this is the line. He says, Pashut shekevan sharov yash in karlakum. He says, most whiskey sold to Gentiles. It's not to the Jews. Like he says, people don't like in America, whiskey's not made for Jews. They don't think about, Jews are target demographic. Like that for me is the amusing part. Yeah.
Right. That is pretty funny. I will say that I'll get back to that, but I'll say that so one misperception people have is they think you're not allowed to lichatchila buy a product that bittul took place with. If that were true, then you wouldn't lichatchila be allowed to buy this whiskey. But that's not the halacha. The halacha is you can't make the mixture to make the bittul happen. Once the bittul happened, then the treif no longer exists. So you could go ahead totally lichatchila at the outset, buy a product in the supermarket that has a trace amount of isser in it that you had bittul. That's the law of bittul. There's no problem doing that once the bittul took place. You want to be frumer and only get something that didn't have bittul, be my guess, but that's not the halacha. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, and this is the real mistake people make, is that they think that it applies when non-Jews do it. Make the mixture. But the halacha is speaking to Jews. It's saying you as a Jew cannot do this thing to create bittul. And if you do, the product is going to be a problem. Now, if you own the factory and you have non-Jews doing it at your behest, that's like you're doing fine. But if it's a non-Jewish factory, the halacha doesn't apply at all. The halacha was never said about that. So, Rav Moshe, to me, what's amazing is if you read Rav Moshe at this line, he says, "Im factory shel hayash hu shel Yisrael." Okay, it's meaning, he doesn't even have to discuss it. If it's a non-Jewish factory, this whole discussion isn't relevant because the whole halacha about making these intentional mixtures are only when it's done by a Jew, okay, or maybe a non-Jew at the behest of a Jew, okay, but and I should actually make an interesting aside. Some people have raised the question that if a hashgacha company goes into a factory and says, well, you're using this ingredient, but it's actually a problematic ingredient, could you lower the amount of it that you're using? So you're using, less than such a little amount that it would do bittul, even though normally they never wanted there to be bittul anyway. But if they do that, then the non-Jew would be changing the mixture at the behest of the Jew in order to effect bittul. So that could actually be a problem of the vatliness or lechatchila. But anyway, Rav Moshe says you have your standard non-Jewish factory, which I imagine is the vast majority of these whiskey companies.
Right.
It's not even a problem. It's only a problem if it's a Jewish factory. And if it's a Jewish factory, said even then it wouldn't be a problem because maybe they shouldn't be doing it. But the product is forbidden for the people for whom it is being produced. And the large majority of the people for whom it's being produced is non-Jews. That's a line you found humorous. Yeah. So therefore, as long as you, the Jews, are not the target demographic, then it is not forbidden to you, okay? It is not, so you're not considered to be the people for whom it is being produced. And it doesn't make sense to say it's forbidden to non-Jews. Halacha doesn't care about non-Jews eating, drinking wine. Right. So since from the halacha's perspective, this is being produced for non-Jews, the product is not forbidden. Now, in a later tshuva, he says, but I don't know, Jews are 10% of the demographic, so it's also being produced for Jews, and the stuff that the Jews buy, that was produced for them. So he says, he deals with that, but he says, no, we really look at it at the macro. It's not being produced fundamentally for Jews, and therefore it's not a problem.
These are the four arguments he marshals to permit. And he then actually has this, it's a really nice language, Zeo Ladina. This is the baseline ruling. This is what normal people should do. But then he says, of all bal nefesh, yesh lo lahachmir al atzmo. So he says, someone who really wants to be stringent, and he speaks elsewhere. He uses this line in numerous teshuvot of his, of someone who seeks to act more stringently. But he says, there's actually four arguments against this, that one should withhold drinking. So the first of these arguments is actually about the bittul aspect, right?
Right. So, but he basically does is he just, in a way, this is just reviewing everything he said before. I mean, he throws in one or two new things.
Yeah.
But remember, we said at the beginning that he like lowers the temperature. He says, yeah, it's not a problem. I'll even drink it myself. If you want to be extra from, you can be from, because he wants to both validate the widespread practice and also not undermine those who are adopting a more machmir position. So in order now to give an acknowledgement to the legitimacy of those who want to be machmir, he goes back and he reviews the reasons that one person might want to be strict. So most of what he does is he just says all of the arguments that he raised, but that he said we rule otherwise. So for example, the Ravid is the one that says 1 in 6, but there are Rishonim who say 1 in 60. You know, there are poskim who say that the rule of 1 in 6 is only by water. It doesn't apply by other liquids like whiskey, so it wouldn't apply. There's this Mata Yehonatan who says it doesn't apply when you've added a thing to improve the flavor. And even though I think that's, Rav Moshe says, absurd, because that's the standard case, but okay, there's an opinion that says it wouldn't apply. And then he adds also one other opinion that he didn't stay until now, which is that some say that even stam yenam, the rabbinic wine that's forbidden, you're not allowed to derive benefit. That's certainly absolutely not the way we paskin, and I don't know anybody, who paskins that way, even in the yeshivish community, but says there are poskim who say that. And if you say that all these leniencies of 1 in 6, don't apply, because at the end of the day, you're deriving benefit from it. It's not a question of, is this wine and are you drinking wine, but did the wine give you some benefit? And the answer would be yes. All right. So based on that, he says he rehearses all the things he said before that he rejected, but there are those other opinions. And therefore, somebody who, and plus there's the issue that some think it's even forbidden in benefit. So if you want to be, so I understand those who want to be more frum and more strict and want to, even though I think, as a matter of halacha, he never wavers from the fact. He doesn't say it's a debate. If you want to, you can be lenient. If you want to, you can be strict. He says, no, as a matter of halacha, it's mutter, period.
Wow.
But because there are stringent opinions out there, it's legitimate to adopt a more stringent approach if that's what you want to do.
And even if someone might then incur the yuhura, this religious haughtiness, but he seems to provide space for that also. He says a bal nefesh should do these things. He says he also provides arguments for the bal nefesh, one who in these situations it would be okay to refrain
meaning
from.
He said, like, I don't want to come off as people think, oh, you're trying to be so firm. It's very funny. Here's Rav Moshe as a gadol ador, and he's saying, when people are all getting together and having a drink, I don't want to be, people think, oh, I'm being so firm. I think people would have given Rav Moshe an allowance to be a little bit firm, but anyway, but right. So at the one hand, he's sort of saying it's legitimate to want to sincerely, and maybe that's the point. He's maybe also trying to communicate, to sincerely say, I want to be concerned about these other opinions. And that is a legitimate position, but maybe you're right. Maybe there's a subtle message where he's also saying, like, don't do it to look for it. Okay. Because even I, Rav Moshe, Dafka, I don't want to be giving off firm airs, and I Dafka will actually.
We don't have to go into the details, but there's a subsequent 2 other teshuvot in this trio, in this trilogy of teshuvot. And I know you mentioned a little bit more about the factories aspect, but clearly Rabbi Teitz was not satisfied, was not happy with Rav Moshe's. I mean, this is a pretty lengthy teshuvah, pretty significant arguments in both directions, and yet Rabbi Teitz is neither happy nor satisfied. But Rav Moshe is able to, over the course of the next 2 teshuvot, continue to further answer his questions. Is there anything really salient that significantly
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think he really adds much that he hasn't already said, or that I didn't already sort of like reference a little bit about, don't they increase the production line because of the Jewish population, but nothing really that changes the argument. It's clear that Rabbi Teitz feels that there's a real problem. One way to look at this, is genuine. Like Rabbi Teitz would not have bothered to have created this whole hechsher if he didn't feel like this was a real halachic problem, and he felt it was weightier than Rav Moshe was giving credit for it, and wanted to have a hearing of his position. A more cynical read would say, he was concerned that Rav Moshe's position would undermine the legitimacy of what he was trying to do in terms of creating this whole hechsher. I don't see any, and this particular product line, I don't see a reason to adopt the more cynical read. I think we should assume that he was very sincere. People that adopt a certain halachic position, and they feel that it's real halacha, they don't want to be told that, oh, it's a nice chumrah. Okay, so I think he genuinely did not accept all of Rav Moshe's positions. Questioned whether, like all the reasons we've said, does the halacha really apply to other liquids or just to water? There are definitely poskim who say that the 1 in 6 only applies to water, not to other liquids. And the mavaklin is for lechatchila because it's they increase their the quantity of production. You could understand why somebody could feel that would still be a concern, although again that would only be if it was a Jewish fact. But he doesn't really say much beyond what we've already discussed.
Hey there, I want to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish Drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right, thank you so much. Now back into the show. Did this have a major, lasting, significant impact?
Well, you would know better than I about how widespread it is in the world of from drinking, do people about the blended whiskies, and do people need a hechsher or not need a hechsher, and so on. I really don't know. My sense is that
can I throw in something?
Please.
Well, it's fascinating to read about these blended whiskeys, and they're both talking about these in 1948. I'm really not familiar. Like, I know that when we have blended whiskeys now, they're literally just blended. Of course, they're now, in the last several years, picking up on the market these flavored whiskeys, but that's a whole other different product out there, because blended whiskeys are literally just taking different runs of whiskeys and mixing them. It's not so much wine being really involved. I know you mentioned also the tax aspect, where having some wine might reduce the tax exposure for these types of products. I don't know.
So, you might be
really
right.
Feels
I
unfamiliar.
have no idea. Yeah, I have no idea whether wine is an issue for blended whiskey. I will tell you though, what I do know, and what I regularly hear, is the big deal is the sherry casks, right? So there's you can sort of jump in here, right?
Right. So sherry casks, I'm not going to go into sherry casks now. I really do think that's a whole separate conversation. At the same time, somehow this people try to drag sherry casks into this. They're like, oh, the Rav Moshe Teshuvot on sherry casks, except that never happened. He did not write about sherry casks, which is very amusing about this trilogy of Teshuvot of his, because they really are speaking about something a lot more limited. Although I will say, I think what these Teshuvot, especially that first one, really highlights and really puts into the spotlight is the 1/6 or 1/2/6 bittel. Exactly. I think that really raises, and not only for drinkers, yes, but also for drinkers considering different drinks that wine may or may not be present in, and thinking about how to calculate that.
Right. The most I've ever heard this Rav Moshe quoted nowadays is not about blended whiskeys. It is about sherry casks. Because once Rav Moshe completely says that the 1 in 6 is the correct position, then that end of story. Then that has a huge impact for the sherry casks, because the concern of the sherry casks. I don't know if you've talked about this.
A little bit.
I think it's so Scotch is now made with. It used to be by default, that's what they were able to buy, get cheap casks from, were leftover casks that were used for sherry shipping, but then they realized that it actually added flavor. So now the premium Scotches make a point of using sherry casks, which are casks that have absorbed wine in them. And And the question is that a problem? Because then the wine, it goes in the cask and then comes back out of the scotch, put in there specifically to add flavor. So this should be a direct application of Rav Moshe. And, and it's exactly correct. Rav Moshe would say, okay, it's less than 1 in 6, not a problem. And there are stories I know that.
Except it depends how you measure it. And I think this is
okay. So I'll get to that.
The two directions. It's not only is it a machlokas shach and taz, the 1/6 versus 160, but it's also how much do you measure? So I think one of them, it's Kadei Klipa, it's just the surface area, and the other one says it's the volume of the entirety of the wood of the barrel. So right. And so it's a two-way achronic machloket. So there are some who say they're always going to be off limits because you need to incorporate the quantity of all the wood, and some who say it's just the surface, and then it will be permissible.
Right. So you've done your research.
That's the nutshell version of it.
Well done. So the normal intuitive reaction before we get to the point we just made is that if you adopt Rav Moshe following the Taz and that 1/6 is absolutely the rule, that of course there is no question that there's not 16% wine in your whiskey. Okay, even the ones that use your scotch, even the ones that use the sherry casks. End of story. Yeah. Okay, and the story is that. Some people, I was sure that somebody went, I forget if it was Rav David or Rav Feinstein, but Rav Moshe's son, and started asking him questions about like scotch with sherry casks. And he said, it's fine. And the guy started hesitating. He said, you got a problem with it? Bring it to me. I'll be happy to take it off your hands. So, but some people have pushed back, have said the argument you said, which is if you actually go ahead and you measure the volume of the thickness of the walls, compared to the volume of contained within the actual cask itself, it is actually more than 1 in 6. And halacha assumes that when a vessel absorbs, it absorbs throughout the entire thickness of its walls. Now, there's two problems with this. One is the halachic point, which is you said that some debate this and say that it's only going to be the thinnest layer at the surface, not the entire thickness of the wall, because no heat is involved. It's all cold absorption. But the other is just asserting a halacha in the face of the latent reality that is against it, right? Like there is absolutely, we could do a test, there's absolutely no question that there was not 16% wine in here. So to say, well, halacha demands that since we don't know, that we have to assume the entire thickness of the wall and ignore the fact that that's 98% wood, and just look at the air gaps, but we have to assume all the wood is wine. Yeah. It's like, to me, that's just absurd. It's like asserting a halachic fiction in the face of blatant reality that is against that. So,
absolutely.
I don't think that when halacha says you have to be concerned, it's when you don't know you have to be concerned. It might be the entire thickness of the wall, but I'm sure there are very easy tests you can do in a lab and a microscope if you have any doubts about whether there's 16% wine in this or not. So the reality is that in Europe, it's pretty widespread to be okay with this. Be okay with a scotch made in sherry casks. But in the U.S., all the major kashrut industries are machmir. Whether they're machmir because they don't like Rav Moshe's psak of 1 in 6, whether they're machmir because they assume, like you were saying, that we have to assume it's more than 1 in 6 wine, which, as I said, is so patently absurd. But they adopt a more machmir position. And that's why the question that I still regularly hear is the sherry cask, because the kashrut industry say it's no good, but people know that in Europe they say it's good, and they know that, based on this Rav Moshe, there's a very strong reason to say that it's fine. So whether it has, large impact, I guess it depends what type of world you live in. I live in a world in which drinking and scotch and sherry casks matters all that much. So for me, the impact of this tshuva is very minor, but for you and for your audience, it might be pretty major.
Yeah, it is. You're right. It is significant. It is definitely significant in that sense. Yeah. Rabbi Linzer, this has been fantastic, insightful. Before we go, is there anything you would like to promote?
Well, I will say, as you mentioned, that I have a new book coming out, co-authored with the amazing Abigail Pope-Rabin, called It Takes Two to Torah. An Orthodox rabbi and Reformed journalist discuss and debate their way through the 5 books of Moses. And it is wonderful reading for the Parsha. It's just like a very easy 4 pages per Parsha, a great give and take and debate, and hearing really 2 people coming at it in a very serious way, but from very serious different perspectives. And there's a tremendous just fun on the page of the way we're sort of, we talk and we engage in the issues. So people should definitely, that's now available on Amazon. And I hope people will look out for the book I'll have coming out probably within about a year's time about my Teshuvot, my halachic responsa. And people could also just go ahead and, if you want to read more of my psakim, psak.yctorah.org. And if you want to see more of my Torah in general, you can go to the yeshiva's Torah website, which is library.yctorah.org. And if you want to just find out about the yeshiva, you should go to www.yctorah.org.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Linzer, and l'chaim.
L'chaim too. Be well.